Lincoln declares, "A house divided shall not stand." We can't have a nation that's half slave and half free. It does mark a turning point in his mind. He recognizes that in his political life, he's going to have to object to slavery in a way that is tougher and more controversial.
Lincoln begins to campaign through the state and invites Douglass to a series of joint debates. Douglass writes back and says, "I'm under no obligation to meet jointly with you. I'm the incumbent senator. I'm the most famous politician in America at this moment. Why am I going to give you space on a platform with me?" But Douglass can't resist.
Afternoon, everyone. Hey, thank you so much for coming out. Appreciate you.
Douglass comes in as the champion. He comes in a train with a special car decorated. He comes with servants, with secretaries.
Man, come on, good to see you.
And Lincoln has to walk from one debate to another. The reputation of Lincoln and Douglass were both on the line here.
They literally are setting up the conflict in the nation.
From when we're both young men, and no one can compete with him in wrestling, or a foot race, or pouring whiskey in his grocery store. We served on the state legislature together. And then Mr. Lincoln submerged for a time, until he reappeared in the hallowed halls of Congress, where he distinguished himself by his opposition to the war with Mexico, taking the side of the common enemy against his own country. And he again submerged. He came up again in 1854, this time in cahoots with Fred Douglass and his abolitionist friends, just in time to create this black Republican platform.
That's right, Douglas. Hit him again. Lincoln, you're two-faced.
If I had two faces, you think I'd be wearing this one?
This old rivalry has come to roost.
Very good, very good.
Lincoln felt that his life had been a flat failure compared to Douglass's. Douglass had gotten further than he had, and now they're running against each other for the Senate.
Now, I am no giant like Judge Douglas. I'm a mere mortal. Now, his ambition, it far exceeds my own. His party, they all expect him to be president one day. Yeah. And then they will all reap the benefits of his greatness. Yeah. But nobody has ever looked at my lean, lank face and expected me to be president.
People come to these debates with all the fervent love and attention that they would bring to a giant sporting event today. But these were more important than any sporting event could have been.
I am here to talk about basic principles. Now, if the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal. And that there can be no moral right in connection with one man making a slave of another.
Now let's talk about principle. I care more for the great principle of self-government, the right of the people to rule, than I do for all the Negroes in Christendom.
When a white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself, and he also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism.
Mr. Lincoln and his ilk want Negro equality in all things. If they get their way, Negroes and whites will be permitted to marry. Negroes will serve on juries. Negroes will vote.
During these debates, Lincoln's not an abolitionist by any stretch, but he's inadvertently making their arguments as he's looking for logic in the constitutionality of all of this.
And he goes way back to Euclid. Euclid is very much about how you prove something beyond any shadow of a doubt. And he's working toward crushing the fallacious arguments on behalf of slavery.
But like most people of the day, he absolutely fervently believes that black people are inferior, whether they're enslaved or freed.
Just because I believe the Negro should be free does not mean that I want to marry one. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. Negroes, like many other men, may not be equal in all things. But if they are men, they are entitled to their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The real issue, which will last long after the tongues of Judge Douglas and I are silent, is the eternal struggle between these two principles, between right and wrong.
What Lincoln does so brilliantly is he takes that core language of the Declaration of Independence and turns it into a nation's moral compass. And he couples that with constitutionality, and he couples that with scripture. He has a really powerful argument.
This is where Lincoln makes his name. One debate after another. Everything had prepared him for the repertoire of talents that he was able to show in these debates. He's telling stories, he's funny, he can talk philosophically, he can talk politically.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates helped Lincoln. It raised his profile, lifted him up a lot, but he loses the election.
One of the things about Lincoln that's amazing is that he loses a lot, but the great ones in life take a loss and they come back.
Even though he loses this election, once again, the loss becomes a platform for him to grow. Underlying it all is there's a passion that he has, a passion for that cause of anti-slavery, which is coming to a head. The general election, he's restless all day long. He's been so familiar with disappointment that he just fears something bad will happen. About 9 o'clock, he and Judge Davis and the friends go to the telegraph office to hear the returns coming in. Finally, midnight, the word comes in that New York has gone Republican. Then the church bells ring, people gather in the streets. This new guy had won. And then he runs home, as he says, to tell Mary, and famously says, "Mary, Mary, we are elected."
Southern states have been saying, if this man is elected, we will have no choice but to secede. And as soon as he is elected, South Carolina decide to have a secession convention. And by December of 1860, they decide to leave the Union.
In February of 1861, 7 U.S. states seceded. The Confederate government formed and puts Jefferson Davis in place as president.
They're seceding for one thing and one thing only, and that is the preservation of slavery and its expansion.
Lincoln believed over-optimistically that there was a way to get these southern slaveholding states back in the Union once he actually got to Washington.
On February 11th, 1861, Lincoln begins the train journey to Washington, D.C. It would have been nice to take the shortest route, but he couldn't go through Kentucky, the state he was born, or Virginia, because it was too dangerous. He wrote a letter to a friend that he was worried he might be lynched. So he has to go on this very winding roundabout route over 1,900 miles. Whenever Lincoln comes in anywhere, everybody comes out to see him.
There's hope, but there's also this fear. People would have known that the southern states have seceded. These are difficult times, and there are credible assassination threats against Lincoln.
There was intelligence of a massive conspiracy to try to assassinate him as he came through Baltimore. The leader of the plot had a system of drawing lots. pieces of paper with a red dot on them. And those who got a red dot would try to kill Lincoln with guns and knives and grenades. But Alan Pinkerton, who was a railroad detective, penetrated the conspiracy with operatives.
Davies, Mr. Pinkerton, it's all true. Anyone who picked one with a red dot is an assassin.
How many have red dots?
8.
It's worse than I thought.
The door's locked from the inside?
Yes, ma'am.
Key, please.
My uncle is an invalid. He requires absolute privacy, do you understand?
You'll take a special overnight train. I've cleared the tracks and had the telegraph lines cut from here to Baltimore. These men intend to create a diversion with the police and stab you to death.
That's all. Like Julius Caesar.
You need to take this seriously, Abe. You have fierce enemies.
If I sneak into the Capitol with fear, I'm showing good people there's reason to fear.
Sir, the worst thing that could happen is you don't make it to Washington at all. You can't risk being recognized.
Take care of it.
This is my associate, Miss Kate Warren.
Mr. Lincoln, it's an honor.
Miss Warren, I am far too plain to pass for your uncle.
Not at all, sir.
I take comfort in the idea that common folk are the best looking. Else why have the Lord made us so many? This is not how I planned to get to Washington.
Lincoln goes from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Washington, at night, in secret, wearing a disguise. He arrives in Washington, 6 a.m., unannounced, and he was attacked. In the press, depicted in these crazy disguises, including kilts, doing the McLincoln Highland fling, and just ridiculed. Not a good thing for a president who was coming to Washington to exhibit courage. Frederick Douglass says, at least now, Mr. Lincoln knows what it's like to travel on the Underground Railroad.
When Lincoln ascends to the presidency and he issues his first inaugural address, African Americans are waiting in anticipation to see what he's going to say. Because by this time, 7 states have seceded from the Union, and African Americans are thinking, this is our opportunity. You know, this is the time to end slavery. You've got this Republican who has won. He's not an abolitionist, but you've got enough Republicans who are ready to move on these people who are seen as traitors to the country.
His first inaugural address is a moment fraught with tension.
There were still very serious fears of assassination.
fellow citizens of the United States, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war.
Lincoln wanted the speech to be strong without being threatening, to try to stem the tide of secession.
The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors.
He says federal forts and armories would be protected. And at the same time, he says, I'm not a threat. And he promised to enforce the hated fugitive slave law.
We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection.
Lincoln had shown this speech to William Seward, and Seward made corrections. And then Seward looked at the ending of the draft, and it says, it's your choice, my friends in the South. Will it be peace or a sword? And Seward says, you can't end it like this. So Seward writes out a really good idea. Lincoln looks at this suggestion and, displaying as much brilliance as an editor as he showed as a writer, he recast Seward's proposal into poetry.
The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
In July 1861, only a few months after Fort Sumter, Union forces under McDowell marched south into northern Virginia for the first encounter of the war, very close to Washington. It happens around the town of Manassas. The battle is alternatively called Bull Run because that was a creek on the battlefield.
Lincoln's expectation going into the first battle of Bull Run is that the war will be settled in this one battle. The South will win its independence, or the North will put down the rebellion. Both armies are green, not a lot of experience. When Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, they are limited to a 3-month enlistment. The Militia Act of 1795, by which he calls them forward, says it's only 3 months.
That's the way we've always done it. You know, the crisis comes along and we call in all the farmers to get your musket over the fireplace. And when the war's over, we send them home to be farmers again.
Lincoln recognizes that his men are not well trained, but politically, it would have been an abject sin to send all those soldiers back home if they hadn't been used in the first place.
The reality is the overwhelming sentiment on both sides was, let's get an army out there and get it done. And so Lincoln and other leaders were pressuring the Union Army under Irwin McDowell to get up there and let's fight.
Even though it seems so foreign to us, there was a great deal of excitement. There was a great deal of war enthusiasm. Keep in mind the technology of the time. We had no way to see a battlefield. People had seen paintings and sketches, and the notion was that these men are in formations and firing at each other, but it must be relatively safe.
There are people who literally showing up there with picnic baskets on their wagons to look at the Army's fight down on the hill.
Congressmen and senators and the social elite of Washington had come out to view the battle. This was a major spectacle. This is major entertainment.
And people really thought this would be their only chance to see one battle. The Union Army crossed the creek. They wage an attack against this very formidable force of Confederates.
Even during these difficult times, these trying times of war, we must remain strong and keep our faith in Him.
Sir, news from the field.
Lincoln is waiting to hear how it's going. And it starts as a Union advantage early in the morning. After church, Lincoln spends the rest of the day in the telegraph office. This will be his source of information.
The arrival of the telegraph, what Lincoln used to call lightning messages, changed the nature of information. Suddenly, what was known in one place could be known in other places almost instantaneously.
Before, you'd get a dispatch that would come in every few weeks or something, and so you really had to give almost complete autonomy to military leaders in the field. Now he's connected by a wire.
The day began very well for the Union. They routed Confederate forces and pushed them back, and not until the late afternoon did the Confederate forces counterattack.
General McDowell has a pretty good plan. The problem was he had a very green army. And so on the battlefield, they had a difficult time maneuvering. The South had many of the same problems, but then the South was fortunate because during the battle, the railroad allowed the South to move reinforcements up, which reached the battlefield at a critical moment.
Federal troops hear the terrifying rebel yell, this high-pitched yelping. Union troops described it as otherworldly. It had enormous results, let's put it that way.
The Confederates start pushing back, and the Federals cross back across the creek in a mad dash. They have been completely routed.
Citizens of Washington who had gone down in their carriages and set up picnic baskets on the bluffs overlooking the battlefield, they were having a high old time for lunch. And then when the battle turned, their picnic baskets were upended. They fled in disarray. And the Union troops had to march back in this searing July heat, humiliated.
For Lincoln now, the defeat is not something that happens hundreds of miles away that you read about. You see wounded soldiers, defeated soldiers, soldiers who've thrown away their arms, come streaming right back into the Capitol. So the idea of a disaster became tangible. You could see it, you could smell it.
What does McDowell say? That the day is lost.
It's probably his first military error. And on that day, Lincoln realized that this was not going to be a brief war. It was going to be a long war.